at the world systems, aka core periphery model. So there are core countries and there are periphery countries. And this map here delineates between core, periphery, as well as semi-periphery, and then other, which would be countries that don't fit into any of those three categories. So this is based on the world systems theory, which proposed a three-tier structure to a one-world economic and political structure. The core countries, which were the US, again this is back in the 70s and 80s, the US, the UK, Japan for example, as one of the few Asian countries in that core structure, dominates other countries. The semi-periphery countries are those which are industrializing. They're not as advanced, not as developed, not as economically strong as the core countries, but those would be countries like Brazil, China, and India. As the countries which are dominated, usually by the core, while at the same time dominating others, usually in the periphery. So those countries like Brazil, China, India, they are in some sense subject to the core countries, and I'll explain what that means in a second, but they are at the same time having some power over those periphery countries. And just getting back to what we have right here, the periphery countries are undeveloped or developing countries like the Congo or Zambia or Haiti, and they are dominated since they're often dependent on the more powerful countries. So let me see if I can get my video back up there. I forgot to do this. Okay, so what's the deal with core countries and periphery and semi-periphery? Well, if you've ever heard the term third world country, which we don't really use anymore, or we try not to, that is a reference to this system where you have basically three groups: the core, which would be the first world, the periphery, which would be second world, and the semi-periphery, which would be second world, which you never really hear about, and then the third world countries, which are periphery countries. So what do we mean when we say dominate the other ones? It really comes down to business, and it comes down to resources. So if you look here at this helpful little picture, we've got the core countries, which have the most economic activity. They've got the big businesses, the multinational corporations. It's a core country, the United States, that has Apple. So we use Apple as an example. Apple collects lots of different resources to make their products, right? They need plastics, they need metals, they need semiconductors, they need glass, they need all these different resources. And so they get those resources often from other countries, both semi-periphery countries and periphery countries. So, for instance, in a number of places in Africa, there are some precious metals which are used in our technology. I don't know the name of them, but these precious metals are really vital to some of our most advanced technology. So we are kind of dependent on them, but those countries don't have the infrastructure to really do much with them themselves. So what they do is they allow outside companies, outside countries, core countries, to get those resources from them, and they get paid something, but of course the money that they get paid doesn't go to the whole country. It usually ends up in the hands of an elite few. It's the same thing with oil. When a poor country, a periphery country, has large oil reserves, but they don't have the means to extract the oil, or they don't have the means to refine the oil and actually make gasoline out of it, then a core country, a more powerful country with the technology and the scientific know-how, and the infrastructure to actually turn that crude oil into a commodity, into something that people will buy, it will come along and benefit from it. So the idea here is that there's this relationship, and the core countries get the biggest benefit because not only do they get their resources from these periphery and semi-periphery countries, but then what do? They create products and sell them. Whether that product is an iPhone that's being sold back to someone in China where it was built, or to someone in India, or even a movie, a Hollywood movie that's sold around the world. So this relationship, some people say, is kind of a modern form of colonialism. And so I want to skip down to this real quick. I don't have much here except the word neocolonialism. So if colonialism was a system in which more powerful countries dominated other countries, taking their resources, in some cases taking their people, or forcing their people to do low-wage work, or even in some cases enslaving people, then neocolonialism is just a new version of that. So you could argue that the way that rich countries export a lot of their labor, how we put our factories over in places like China so that we can get cheap labor, you could argue, and not everyone's arguing this, but you could argue that's a form of neocolonialism. Now, the big argument against that argument is that those countries are actually benefiting from it. But we don't have time to get into a debate right now. And it's also not fair to get into a debate when I'm the only one talking. But I just wanted to bring neocolonialism up because it really relates to this core periphery idea. Okay. The heartland theory and the rimland theory we've gone over before, but these are theories about power structure across the world. The heartland theory from around 1904 states that the resource-rich, land-based pivot area, the heartland, generally... I live on a busy street. Generally, this region here would be key to world dominance. So at the time in which this theory came out, this was controlled by the USSR, the Soviet Union, which was diametrically opposed to this other guy, Mahan's contention of sea power, which fed into Spikeman's theory of the rimland, which we're going to get to in a second. But the idea here is this is the biggest chunk of land in the world, and if you control that, then from there you can go out and control these other areas. This was a very important idea, and it's one that Adolf Hitler actually based his idea of global conquest on, that if he could control this center of Europe, then he would be at the helm of the most powerful empire the world had ever seen. And that's why he was so hell-bent on taking over part of Russia, and fortunately was unsuccessful. Now the rimland theory is kind of a different idea. The rimland theory says, no, it's not the heartland, but the Eurasian rimland that would be key to global power. The rimland would be important in containing the heartland. Britain, the US, and the USSR would be the main power players. So kind of playing off of this little limerick that was created by Mackinder, which said, who rules East Europe commands the heartland, who rules the heartland commands the world island, who rules the world island controls the world. Spikeman, and of course Spikeman was writing in the context of World War II, having seeing what's going on there, said, who controls the rimland rules Eurasia, who rules Eurasia controls the destinies of the world. This idea of containment, which I don't need to go into in detail here, but it will come up in some of your other classes, which was the main policy of the United States against communism, was that if you can control an area around the area you're worried about, you can prevent whatever it is from spreading. And in that case, communism. We didn't want communism to spread to the whole world. Or Nazism. So this idea of containing, right? And that's why it was so important for the Allies in World War II to be able to take back over this part of Europe at least, and for Russia to be able to hold this part of Europe so that Nazism could not expand too far. If you don't understand the historical references there, that's okay. Don't worry about that. You just need to understand the difference in those two theories. And if someone was to ask you which one makes the most sense now, well, the Rimland theory makes the most sense now because we've seen that the United States, without having control of the heartland, has become the one global superpower. And that's in a large way as a result of its navy, massive navy. But also because of winning World War II, that kind of cemented the United States in that position. But it will be interesting to see, as China has a sizable portion of the heartland, if this theory will come back into play, because we are seeing China start to have more influence in its western region. Okay. So real quick, Thomas Malthus, remember he was the doomsday guy who believed that population was going to rise so rapidly that many people would start dying from starvation. And here's just a little graph showing his theory. The central idea is about carrying capacity. Limiting factors in nature such as food, resources, and they stay constant in nature or grow arithmetically, meaning food supply grows it doesn't multiply. It will grow, but it doesn't multiply. When the carrying capacity is reached, and the carrying capacity is how much a certain area of land can provide for a people, so how many resources are available. There's a finite number of resources, theoretically, but population grows exponentially. There's not a finite number of people. When the carrying capacity is reached, limiting factors in population begin to take place. Limiting factors are those factors that limit the population growth. That means people die. A population cannot exceed the carrying capacity without ramification, without some bad thing happening. This was his idea. This is not what I'm telling you. This was the Malthusian idea. So the idea is that population can grow geometrically. Now, without getting too bogged down into the mathematics of that, his idea is, look, your population can grow this much, but this is how much food we have. So what happens when the population gets that high? It's going to stop. It's going to stop growing, and there's going to be an incredible amount of suffering along the way. Now, he ended up being wrong, and we kind of take it for granted at this point that we've been able to dramatically increase our food supply. And we've continued to year after year. There are some neo-Malthusians who believe, look, we've done so pretty good so far, but when Malthus was talking, we didn't have 7 billion people. We didn't even have 3 billion people on Earth. And so, as some neo-Malthusians believe, we're going to get to a point where we actually will reach a carrying capacity. There's only so much food we can grow. But most people, most researchers and scientists and geographers would say we've been able to produce a great amount of food, and the population will start to slow down before we get to that overall carrying capacity. And when we say overall, that's an important point, because some parts of the world really have started to reach this, right? Where their population has grown so fast and continue to grow in part because of modern medicine, which is a good thing, keeping people alive, keeping infants alive, cutting down on infant mortality. But their food supply has not dramatically increased as well as their health. And so that means you've got a lot of people and some strain on resources. But resources that neo-Malthusians think about are not just food anymore, but also things like, of course, water. And water is a finite resource. It is one that replenishes itself, but it is finite. But also energy. Energy is a big one that people talk about. And if we don't switch to green energy fast enough, then there is a real sense that we could use up our fossil fuels because those are finite. There's only a certain amount of that energy out there. Okay, just a little bit more officially about this. So Malthus gave a dystopian view of the future back in 1798, where he said food production increases arithmetically, whereas human reproduction increases geometrically. It doubles each generation. So if I have 2 kids and each of my kids have 2 kids, then the population has grown geometrically. Despite checks on population, like plague or famine, a check, remember, is something that keeps it from growing, there would continue to be starvation. Okay, jumping to another person, in 1965, Esther Boserup discussed that population growth stimulates intensification in agricultural development. It stimulates technology. Rather than being increased by agricultural output, the rate of food supply may vary, but never reaches its carrying capacity because as it approaches the threshold, an invention or development increases food supply. However, the depletion of nutrients creates diminishing returns. Okay, big idea here is that with more people, you also have more brains. You also have more ideas. You also have more possible inventions. So, and it's an idea that's applied to a lot of different problems. The idea that population growth is not necessarily a bad thing because it can create more economic activity, which will help aid in technology and in inventions. And so it's kind of the problem is its own solution to the problem. That's an idea. Okay, modernization model. We've been talking about different countries in the core category and in the semi-periphery and in the periphery. The question is, how do countries move from the periphery to the semi-periphery to the core? How do countries become developed? How do countries modernize? Don't worry about how this says liberal. That's just kind of a distraction. It's not talking about politics, really. But the stages of development is an idea from Rostow, and it's also called the modernization model. A traditional society is an old school society, okay? This is going to be a periphery country or a periphery population. People are largely doing agriculture. That's the primary sector. Primary sector is a type of job, and you're just dealing with natural resources, whether it's agriculture or cutting down lumber or getting fuel or digging up coal. That's a primary sector job. And that's what everyone's doing in a traditional society. And there's very few people doing secondary work, which is manufacturing things. Not just cutting down that tree, but taking that tree that someone's cut down and building a bench out of it. That's a secondary sector. Tertiary sector is more advanced jobs like teaching, so advanced, or being a lawyer or a doctor. Those would be tertiary. There's actually another one which is quaternary, which is dealing with large sums of information. Don't worry so much about memorizing these yet, because these were in a later unit that we didn't have time or have to get to. But I do want you to know how a society basically goes through these levels of development. So it moves into the preconditions for takeoff, where there's still a lot of people working in agriculture, but some people are starting to do industry. Maybe some factories have been set up by more developed countries within that country. And then takeoff. So you've got more people moving into the cities to work in those factories. There's still few people working in other kind of service industries. Those tertiary sectors are service industries. They're in stores or serving as teachers or police or doctors. But there's a lot of people in factories, right? This is what the stage that China's been in for the last couple decades. But they've really kind of moved into the drive to maturity, which is where even fewer people in agriculture, there's more technology in agriculture, and so not as many people have to work in it. And besides that, there's more people living in cities, so they're not even out on the farm anymore. The secondary sector is stable. It's not growing as dramatically, but there's a lot of people working in that. And because there's been so much economic activity there, there's more money. And so people now have money that they can go spend in a store. So those more stores are opening up, and people are now working in the service industry, in the tertiary sector. More restaurants are opening up. So people are working in those restaurants in the tertiary sector. More doctors' offices and hospitals and law practices are opening up. More schools can be built. So the height of modernization is high mass consumption. There's very few people working in agriculture. Like in the United States, it's somewhere around 2% people are full-time farmers. The secondary sector is declining. We've got less manufacturing going on now, at least as far as the number of people working in manufacturing, because we're sending that manufacturing over to less developed countries, over to semi-periphery and periphery countries, mostly semi-periphery, because labor is cheaper over there. And people would rather work in an office than in a factory most of the time. And the vast majority of people are either working in offices, doing some kind of service on the computer or on the phone, or they're working in stores or restaurants or schools. And so this is the era that most highly developed countries are in, high mass consumption, and we are consumers. We buy a lot of things, and we have a lot of things produced for us. Okay, I know that was really fast. This isn't necessarily something you'll be asked about on this exam, but the ideas that play into it are core geographic ideas that you should be familiar with, and that's why I went over it. You can pause here if you want to read this and look over it again. It's really more of the same. Okay. Real quick, the organic theory from Ratzel, who was a German geographer, was discussed in this seminal work, Geopolitics of 1901. And the idea that came from it was Lebensraum, which means living space in German. His organic theory postulated that a country, which is an aggregate of organisms, people, would itself function and behave like an organism. So the idea is if you're not growing, you are dying. Okay? If you're not growing, you're dying. And if a country is to survive, then it needs to continue to grow. And in the global context, this means territory. It means it needs to gain political power. This theory was crucial to Hitler's idea of living space, of Lebensraum. It was a big part of his platform and his push for Germany to expand its borders. So, it can be a pretty dangerous theory. All right, we already went over Ravenstein. No, we didn't. Ravenstein's laws of migration. He had about 10 or 11 laws. I'm just going to give you a few of the most important ones. These are kind of simplified or in more simple language. Most migration is over short distances. True, right? Yes, a lot of people move across the world, but a lot more people move across the city. Long-range migrants are usually moved to urban areas because they're pulled there. Those pull factors are in cities. They're not mostly in the country. You're not going to move from Bangladesh to the United States and then move to Bucksnort, Tennessee. You're going to move to a city where there's a job opportunity or where there are people you know, that chain migration that brings you to a certain spot. Rural dwellers, people in the countryside, are more migratory than urban dwellers. Why is that? Because they're moving to the city. Okay, the big trend in migration for hundreds of years has been that people move into cities. Large towns grow more by migration than by natural increase. This one we can apply a number of geographic ideas to. One, that people in the city have fewer kids because it's more expensive to raise kids in the city than it is out in the countryside. And because women in cities are more likely to have an education goal or career goals, and therefore either put off having a family for a while or just have a couple kids, one or two, so they can get back to their career more quickly. And so large towns are going to grow more by migration that way, and also because large towns attract a lot of immigrants. And males are more migratory over long distances. That's because males are less tied down in many cases, and often the male of a family will head out and find a place to live and maybe start generating some income and save enough money to where he can bring the rest of his family over. Most migrants are adults. Duh. It'd be kind of weird if kids migrated more than adults. And migration is mostly due to economic causes. There is forced migration where people have to flee because of political persecution or because of natural disaster, Hurricane Katrina, or the war in Iraq, or the war in Syria most recently. But most migration is because people want a better life. People want to make more money. This was from, what is this? This is from the gravity model, which we already went over. Okay, real quick. You've heard of the Renfro hypothesis, but not with that name. I called it the Anatolian hypothesis. And this is about the spread of language. So it states that language spread through the innovation of agriculture rather peacefully from Anatolia. So the idea is that these agricultural ideas spread, and with them language. Remember that one. The other big theory about how language spread was the Kurgan hypothesis, and that was no, language didn't spread peacefully. Language spread, the Proto-Indo-European languages spread from modern-day Ukraine through conquest from these Kurgan warriors. Okay? Those are the two language theories. This is the Köppen climate system. You don't have to memorize this, but what I do want you to know for the exam is the differences between different types of climates and generally where you're going to see them. Okay? So tropical moist climates, these are very warm climates found in the tropics that experience high quantities of precipitation, a lot of rain. The primary distinguishing characteristic of these climates is all months have average temperatures above 18 degrees Celsius. Where are we going to find those? Near the equator, right? All the way around the globe, near the equator, you're going to have tropical moist climates. Why does it matter when thinking about geography, thinking about the cultural landscape, the human landscape? Because it's going to impact what people eat, what people wear, impact, and you could argue it will impact people's economic level. all around the equator. The closer you are to the equator, the less likely you are to be living in a rich country. Okay, China is a little bit closer, but it's really mostly at about the same latitude as the United States. But equatorial countries have not done as well, and there's a lot of different theories about that. But one of them, postulated by Jared Diamond, would argue that because their climate doesn't allow for the production of grains quite as well as it does, fruits and the kind of stuff that grows on trees, that it hasn't allowed for long-term food security quite as much. That's kind of an oversimplification of one of the ideas, but you can think about how climate is going to impact people's lives. Dry climates, I'm just trying to go a little bit fast here. These are climates that experience little precipitation during most of the year. Further potential losses of water from evaporation and transpiration greatly exceed atmospheric input. Basically, they don't got a lot of water. That's obviously not going to allow for a lot of human flourishing. If you're constantly worried about getting enough water, you're not going to be able to do agriculture very well. You're not going to be able to spend a lot of time doing other things like inventing stuff. And so when we think about the advancement of different civilizations around the world, this is getting more into history than geography, but it all plays together. The environment must play a big role. Where did the Industrial Revolution occur? Well, it started in Great Britain. Part of that was their intellectual curiosity and know-how, but a big part of it was that their climate allowed them to have plenty of food. It's a good place to do agriculture, and so people could start trying to find new methods and new ways to do things better. Moist mid-latitude climates with mild winters. In these climates, summer temperatures are warm to hot and winters are mild. The primary distinguishing characteristics of these climates is the coldest month has an average temperature between 18 degrees Celsius and -3 degrees Celsius. So these are pretty good places to do agriculture. Warm summers for growing crops, and then winters that aren't too cold, that won't kill off all your crops. Moist mid-latitude climates with cold winters. In these climates, summer temperatures are warm and winters are cold. The primary distinguishing characteristic of these climates is the average temperature of warmest months to exceed 10 degrees Celsius. Average temperature of coldest is below -3 Celsius. Polar climates, terrible for agriculture, terrible to live in. Very cold winters and summers, no real summer. The primary distinguishing characteristics, warmest month is going to have an average temp below 10 degrees Celsius. And then lastly, highland climates. These climates are strongly influenced by the effects of altitude. As a result, the climate of such locations is rather different from places with low elevations. So if you're in a place like Tibet, which is at a very high altitude up in the mountains of the Himalayas, then you're again going to struggle with agriculture, and that's going to really prevent your society from developing, at least in the way that the Rostow model decided that development should occur. Now, I didn't point out, and I should have, the Rostow model, again, this up here, it makes a big assumption that countries want to modernize this way, that countries want to enter an age of mass consumption. And maybe not, that's not the best thing for all countries. But agriculture is going to play into how quickly and how well you develop. So this guy I mentioned just a minute ago, Jared Diamond, he believes that those countries, those civilizations, those populations that have become the most wealthy are really just lucky. They're not necessarily better or smarter or more hardworking, but they have geographic luck. And Some of y'all read this book, Guns, Germs, and Steel, where he really takes that idea and develops it and makes some good cases for it. And a big part of it is talking about different environments that allowed agriculture to do either really well or not so well. And this is a prime example of environmental determinism. That it's not the people that really make or break their success, it's their environment. Okay. So, agricultural hearths, we're not going to go over all of them, but you need to know that different agricultural hearths have existed, and from there, different agricultural practices spread. Okay? Okay, generalized map of world religions. You should pretty much know this. You should know where Hinduism is. You should know where Buddhism is. You should know which part of North America is Catholic. Okay? This part over here, primarily. And then this part down here, primarily. You should know, where do Jewish people live? Mostly in New York. Of course, there's Jewish people throughout the United States. But where's could you say is the majority? New York and the North in general, and of course over here in the Eastern Mediterranean state of Israel. Where's the Islamic world? Across North Africa and Southwest Asia. Where is Eastern Orthodox Christianity? It's in Eastern Europe. Which countries are Catholic in Europe? The countries closer to the Mediterranean are more likely to be Catholic, and the countries in the north are more likely to be Protestant Christian. And that's because the Protestant Reformation occurred in Germany in the north, and it spread north more easily because the Catholic Church, which was controlled and always has been, well, not always, but was controlled from Rome and is today, did not have as much control over these northern countries. You should know that a lot of countries that Great Britain helped to start are going to be Protestant, because Great Britain is largely Protestant. And a lot of parts of the world where Spain and France had their empires are going to be Catholic, like the Philippines. Shintoism is in Japan. Buddhism started in India but moved east. And Hinduism is not widespread because it is an ethnic religion. And because the Indian civilization did not spread outside of the Indian subcontinent. Okay? There are still tribal religions, animist religions, which we find in Africa, interspersed with Christianity in the south, but it's mostly Islam in the north because of its proximity to the hearth of Islam, Saudi Arabia. I think that will do for the global scope. Looking at the United States, these are different religious groups here. Feel free to pause this and look at that. We've been over this many times. Big idea is knowing that the Lutheran Church is primarily up here because of Scandinavian immigrants who settled here. Catholicism is going to be more likely outside of the South. It's going to be here because of Latin influence, here because of Latin influence, all the way around here because of the Latin influence, and up here because there's so many big cities up there. And immigrants move to big cities. And then the number one immigrant identity, or the group that is most likely to immigrate to the United States, is people of Latin origin, Latinos, Hispanics. So if they're moving to the U.S., a lot of them are going to move the place that's closest, or they're going to move to the place that has the most opportunity, the big cities. All right, and this is going to wrap it up. You heard me mention the economic sectors when we were talking about the Rostow stages of development. The primary sector, and again, I don't know that this will come up on the test, but it should help you understand stuff. The primary sector is production of raw materials. Agriculture is in here. Secondary sector, making stuff. Transforming raw materials into goods, whether it's making clothes or making ships or making canoes or making cars. Some of it's very simple, like textiles, cloth. Some of it's very advanced, like making fighter jets. Tertiary sector, this is the biggest one in the United States, the provision of services to consumers and businesses. My service is knowledge, teaching. I'm in the tertiary sector. Lawyers are in the tertiary sector. Usually, when you go up this, we're talking about higher levels of pay, right? Most farmers in the world don't make much money. It gets a little different in different countries. There are some pretty wealthy farmers in the United States. Most people, though, working in a factory aren't making very much money. People working in a shop might be making pretty good money, but there's going to be a big variance here. Now, if you get into this, the quaternary sector, which is information and environmental technology, and also business leaders, okay, CEOs, CFOs. This is people who have are highly educated, have a high level of expertise. Now, some would argue that teaching is in this category. My bank account probably would not argue that, but I don't know. I've seen it go both ways. I've looked this up extensively, and there's not one definitive answer for where education is. So some types of jobs kind of drift in and out of these different categories, but understanding those should help you understand how a country modernizes. The most modern country is going to have a lot of people in this, most people in this, fewer people in this, and very few people in this one. And the least developed country is going to have most people in this one, just providing food for their own family. All right, that is all. So, shut it off. Bye-bye.